Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is David Chavern. I'm the president and CEO of the News Media Alliance, and this is News Take. Our News Take conversations are designed to be kind of wonky chats designed to offer unique perspectives and insights around all of the innovation taking place in the news media industry and how different organizations are applying that innovation. We really do try to get into the weeds with people who are changing the news industry, particularly those who are helping make better news products and whose perspectives aren't always heard. Today, I am very, very excited to welcome Mitra Kalita to the show. Mitra is a veteran journalist, media executive, commentator, and author of two books. She is the co-founder and CEO of URL Media, a network of Black and Brown community news outlets that share content and revenue. URL Media works with mainstream newsrooms to syndicate content and partner on diversity initiatives in content, staffing, and culture. She's a co-founder and publisher of Epicenter NYC, a newsletter designed to help New Yorkers get through the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as newsletters The Unmuted and The Escape Home. Previously, Mitra was Senior Vice President at CNN Digital, overseeing national news, breaking news, programming, opinion, and features teams. She also worked in leadership roles at the Los Angeles Times and at Quartz. She sits on a number of journalism boards, most notably and most importantly, the board of the News Media Alliance, my board. So I'm super thrilled to have her. Welcome, Mitra. Super excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having me. This is going to be fun.
Super. So let's just start, talk about yourself a little bit. Tell us about your career journey. How did you get into this business? And then how did that work its way to you deciding to start your own news media outlet?
Oh gosh, well, we can start, I think, when I was 12, if you're willing to go back
Fantastic.
that far. So my parents were immigrants from India, and in the 1980s, my father got an offer to move to Puerto Rico. And so I spent much of my childhood in Puerto Rico, and that's
Cool.
significant because as we were about to move to the mainland, my parents broke us this news. And just to kind of give you context, we had a great house in Puerto Rico. We had a pool, we had a banyan tree. It really was this amazing existence as a child.
Cool.
And as the child of Indian immigrants, so often you grow up in, I think people are familiar with hyphenated identities where you're Indian and you're American. For me, being in Puerto Rico was like this kind of curveball, but was also really great because there's so much similarity with, at least as a tropical island, like the place my parents came from. And so it was a very warm upbringing. And my parents said, we're moving to New Jersey. Not
a little different.
Yeah, very different. And in protest, and I look at, of course, you look at your life with like the benefit of kind of 2020 hindsight. I quickly fashioned a newspaper to protest their decision. And I didn't realize what I was doing until years later that I learned more about media, understood kind of the voice that journalism enables. But, that's like my earliest memory of journalism in my life. The newspaper was ineffective. It was great for my career and a kind of an anecdotal story of where it all began, but it kind of fell on deaf ears. My parents did move us to New Jersey.
It was opinion heavy, probably. Just in terms of content, it was probably opinion heavy.
And life comes full circle because we'll get to the my life now. So, but anyway, so I moved to New Jersey and I joined the school newspaper as an activity to make friends. And in my first week of 7th grade, I found myself interviewing the principal, and I thought, this is so cool because I'm this new girl. I never would have met the principal otherwise. And so that's kind of how my career in journalism took off. I ended up, doing, I think it's important to note that I came of age in journalism during efforts to diversify newsrooms. There was a program run by the Dow Jones Newspaper Fund that was pretty pivotal in my entry and kind of retention in newsrooms. So in high school.
Oh, it's interesting.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure you're familiar with these programs. They just targeted high schoolers like me and said, learn about this as a career. And if you're from a background where your parents don't know about journalism, my dad was an engineer by training and then went to work at a bank. My mom was mostly a housewife, and then she worked for the state of New Jersey as an unemployment clerk later in her life. They didn't, I mean, news is something other people did.
Right.
And so these programs were just amazing because they're as much for you as they are for your parents, like just to get them comfortable with this career. So I did this program. I ended up going to Rutgers. I worked on the school newspaper, and then kind of I did the classic trajectory where you work in one market and then you graduate to the next big market, and then you kind of go on and on and on. And that was my career.
So, it is interesting. A lot of these programs, when you hear people talk about them now, the results can be kind of ephemeral. So it's sort of like, it's a good idea, but who knows the outcome. Yeah. And then to see it on the other side, where you see these programs at various times, where like it changed the course of your career, right? The really? Fact that's and it's really, I think it's really important to tell those stories so that you kind of people stay committed to those and similar programs now, because they really do have effect. Could be long-term effect, but they really do have effect. Yeah. So tell me, let's talk a little bit about URL Media. So you'd been in a lot of news outlets of various kinds, most notably at CNN. Then how do you? This is an important space for entrepreneurism, but also a really tough space for entrepreneurism. And so how did you come around to thinking you wanted to start your own thing? And then talk a little bit about sort of the core business model of URL Media. What's your approach been?
So it was actually exactly 2 years ago. So March of 2020 was when the world changed, right? Yeah. And I remember we didn't send one daughter to school that day, and then we picked up the other one early, and we had these IKEA bags full of our lives. Yeah. And we moved in with my parents to New Jersey because my father, unfortunately, had suffered a second stroke. And we were in that classic case of, do you distance from your parents, or do you kind of full on say, okay, we're cocooning together now?
Yeah, it's one or the other.
You're else again, right?
You're either going to be waving at them from the outside or right in the living room.
But it felt like you had a split second to make that decision. And so we decided to go all in just because of the caregiving aspect. I live in Jackson Heights, Queens, where actually the pandemic struck early. It struck early and struck often. I mean, we were really hard hit. And we became known as the epicenter of the epicenter, which becomes important to a product I later launched. But, I moved my whole family, the four of us, in with my parents in New Jersey. I had not lived with them since high school. So that was interesting. And went about, I worked at CNN. I was a senior vice president. My team was more than 200 people. I had, the breaking news teams, the opinion team, health, opinion, features, and programming, which is digital distribution, all reporting into me. And so you can imagine the pandemic was a challenging time where every single member of our team needed to be firing on all cylinders. And for me, there was a transition that occurred in those months at CNN, which I had been advocating for years, because it's not coincidental that my entire backdrop at CNN was also the presidency of Donald Trump. And as you might imagine, working at CNN during the presidency of Donald Trump is kind of an all-consuming affair. I mean, when you get to Friday, I would just like come back home and collapse and wait for the next tweet that would ruin my weekend, right? Like that was my existence. But for years, I had been advocating for a more comprehensive, we often use diversity, and especially for me in terms of race, but I had been advocating for diversity in our report, right? Could we go beyond Donald Trump? And digitally, you can do that, but TV, I think CNN viewers would feel like you turn on the TV and you see one story, right? I mean, it's kind of the way linear television is. Yeah. The pandemic forced not just diversity of storytelling, meaning this is a global event, right? So the CNN-ness of it, we're everywhere, we could tell you what's happening on the ground, married to an aspect that I think has been harder for our industry writ large, and we talk about this a lot at the News Media Alliance, as you know, to embrace, of service journalism, right? How can we squarely, make ourselves utility to our user, even as we're covering the news. So of course there's mask, no mask, what's the CDC saying? But the truth is, for months, and even I think to the present day, one of the top searched Google terms is COVID symptoms, right?
Yeah.
And so how do you continue to meet your audience where they are, which is as basic as COVID symptoms, even as we're covering to mask or not mask and the politicization of this, which happened very quickly. And so I share that as the backdrop to the founding of Epicenter and URL Media, because there was a pivot that I was able to be a part of at CNN that I think much of our industry knew we needed to go down this road, and was looking at the post-Trump I was going to say the Trump bump,
reality.
what would happen, right? Like the Trump bump will end even if Trump had gotten to a second term, right? And so what becomes of us was kind of a ruthless question, but also in service to our users, like what will we continue to do? And so COVID changed some of my work at CNN. And then it did another thing, which is I was between New Jersey caregiving for my family and my home in Jackson Heights. It literally felt like every time we came back to get stuff or spend a night here before going back there, the sirens were constant, and the fear in this neighborhood was quite palpable. This was literally one of the hardest hit areas of the country by COVID. And so what happened, my husband and I are pretty involved in our neighborhood, and people just started asking us, what's the line at Patel Brothers like? Does anyone know a hospital that has a ventilator? Does anyone know childcare we can get when both parents have COVID? Kind of the neighborly type questions, but that are really rooted in survival. And then picture me running CNN, the largest game on the internet, the largest website on the planet, and trying to kind of figure out that ground game that I'm getting from Jackson Heights, but also I'm just getting from Google search, right? Like everybody's asking questions. And how do you marry these two things? And so just as like a good neighbor, and my husband's been really involved in helping small businesses and so forth, years before we launched this company. And one thing I'll say just as an aside about local news, there's a lot of people getting into local news, but you kind of can't fake your commitment to your community, right? Like,
no, cannot.
Suddenly you were like this national news executive, but you never gave your neighbor sugar, like they will call you out on that, right? And so thankfully my husband and I were legitimately involved in our neighborhood, and we were sending emails every day with these requests that were coming in. We would amplify them to groups of, let's say, 50 of our friends. And finally we said, gosh, this is we're going to go broke, and this is not, we're going to the same 50 people over and over for help. Right? Is there another way? And so we launched Epicenter as a newsletter. We launched in July of 2020. We intended to launch in May, but there's another event that we might talk about that happened at the end of May in 2020. And which of course is the death of George Floyd. And so we were delayed a little bit. We launched the newsletter. It takes off. It's pretty beloved in the community. But remember, my lens on the world is CNN. I am the biggest game on the planet. And here's this newsletter. And while it's beloved, I know the importance of scale, not just for impact, but also because in order to be successful on the internet, in order for something like COVID symptoms to be a search term that everybody knows, it is entirely rooted in your numbers and your scale.
Sustainability,
there's no sustainability of kind of what I just described, Epicenter, a newsletter for this neighborhood that needs it. Great, but how do you, and again, we'll get to the revenue in a moment, but how do people even know about you? Because if you're living in Jackson Heights and you're searching, is there a line at Patel Brothers? I guarantee you the New York Times is not covering that. CNN is not covering that. Even the Queen's Chronicle is not covering that. So how am I going to be discoverable, right? And so this predicament, which I, proudly wore the hat of, the woman at CNN who could make anything go viral, who could get traffic on a story. I am not ashamed of that, right? Is trying to reconcile this local news product that I've just launched. By the way, I'm still at CNN, mind you, I still have a day job. With literally, how do you serve a community when the internet actually makes it impossible to serve a community, right?
Yeah, actually, I've talked about this before and this is very interesting about 2020, 2021, in that there has been this long term, and it's an internet phenomenon of nationalization of news attention, meaning, because of the internet, people in Anchorage were talking to people in Atlanta more often, and they wanted to talk about things they had in common, which was national political and Kim Kardashian and all sorts of general interest
That's
stuff.
right.
And that, so for my parent and your parents' generation, my parents' generation in particular, national would have been further, Nixon was further down the news funnel than what happened locally. And of course, that all flipped. But there was something, and Trump, by the way, was the gasoline on the fire, right? Everything, the top 15 of everything became about Trump. But there was something, and you've described it very very textually of both COVID and racial justice issues and the rest that really spun the telescope around, right? All of a sudden people cared what their mayor had to say when frankly, most people had no clue who their mayor was in most places.
Yeah.
Like and then how do you grab this moment, right? And figure out how to build a business around it. But it really struck me as you're describing it, as your story really is there's a whole that's happening at some level in every community, but
Absolutely.
Everybody's not figuring it out as well.
Yeah. I mean, one of Epicenter's taglines is, the 20 blocks around you has never mattered more, right? And I think we really—
That's great.
I mean, and so what happened was, even though neighborhoods like Jackson Heights were so hard hit in the pandemic, they were also oddly ascendant, right? The same reason that my husband and I live here, which is, we embrace diversity, we embrace family life, we're kind of lazy, so we love that there's a lot of takeout and really good produce, really good restaurant. The dry cleaners right here. I mean, you can center your life in New York City neighborhoods, and I think a lot of neighborhoods across the country have similarly seen being ascendant because they offer the ability to kind of live your life and work. And remember, there's a lot of the work from home phenomenon is a part of this now. But what about this issue of scale that you've also just outlined from what we're up against? And it's, and I present it as local news, but I think in many ways we're all up against this. And so there's a woman who runs a radio station, WURD, which is Philadelphia's Black Talk radio station. It's one of only 3 Black Talk radio stations that are independently owned left in the country. She's a friend of mine. We had done a program together years ago, and we bonded. And after the death of George Floyd, we would just talk to each other because I was, launching this newsletter. Yeah. She knows a lot about community and being in constant conversation with them in a way that I think, kind of to your point, there were all these conversations happening on social media. The conversation was getting very national. Black Philadelphians connecting with each other in sort of the Luddite telephone to radio station really offered me this pulse on what was possible in a transformative way. So we would have these conversations, and we said there has to be something that allows us to band together. Some of it was inspired by George Floyd, but honestly, Dave, a lot of this was the economics of the internet. How do we feel bigger than we are without sacrificing who we are?
Yeah.
And so we said, well, what if we instead of launching yet another website? And again, Epicenter was a newsletter. Notice I didn't launch as a website, right? We really embraced the distributed form. And there was a trend for sure after the death of George Floyd and the racial justice protests of launching new initiatives. This mainstream outlet will launch the race team, or there'll be this Black news channel. And I don't disparage any of that. They're needed. But we wondered whether leaning into what already existed both helped us from, I knew this from CNN, right? Just from a search and trusted legacy perspective, age actually helps you on the internet. You've been around. You're not going to And also in 2020, I don't know what you think about this, but I was like, you can't launch a business on Facebook now. I've launched many
No.
digital products on Facebook.
Yeah.
2020, I think we had
Cannot.
we said, no, forget it.
Right.
And so URL Media was born out of really two publishers who said, we're facing challenges. We're going to keep going it alone in our publishing realms. We still believe we can innovate a model for WURD. There's a model for Epicenter, but is there additive revenue that we can get as a network? And importantly, is there an ability to achieve scale?
Yeah.
Can we achieve scale? So coming out of the gate, so just to kind of fast forward, URL Media launched in January of 2021, days after the inauguration of Joe Biden, very intentional. And we launched with 7 million users because the strength of our partners is really our collective strength. Individually, you know, it's a lot harder to achieve kind of that scale in the manner that we were able to launch with.
Yeah, that's really powerful. First of all, for a bunch of reasons, I'm a big fan of networks, particular networks of local. There are data reasons for that. There are reasons related to just capacity and assets, whatever. So, I mean, I think that idea is super compelling. And also, I have to tell you, one of the things I really liked when you launched URL is you were pretty explicit about being, at least in format, a for-profit enterprise. Yeah, enterprise. And I think that's important for a number of reasons. You know, there's been this whole sort of flood of a viewpoint that only listen, I got both kinds of my membership. I got one of,
so do I.
Yeah, I got one of everybody. And so I'm fine with all that. But, you know, there is a power that, you know, economic dependence and diversity of revenue sources is its own assurance of viewpoint independence, right? And getting money from a lot of different means and monetizing a lot of different means, I think, is the best chance you have to have viewpoint independence. You know, economic independence is an important part of the deal. Absolutely. So, you know, just talk for a minute about that, and then how you think about revenue models for the URL.
So I think we're in some ways benefited by this moment of launching, where a lot of legacy media outlets had to kind of drag to drink diversified revenue model out of the water, like, trough, if you will, right? Like they just had to embrace multiple streams. Now what we're up against is kind of legacy media and the one thing it does. I think we're also a little bit up against Silicon Valley and the startup model of you do one thing and you do one thing well and don't do anything else. And media is just a different ballgame. So when URL launched, the for-profit model was important to us for a few reasons. One, I've just articulated that I come from CNN, which is the biggest of the big. Our ambitions are big, right? I have a very good life as a media executive. And I don't think we talk about that enough, nor are we upfront about the wealth creation that is possible when you launch a business. And so Sarah and I were really upfront about our desire to be ambitious, our desire to be bold, our desire to be profitable, not just sustainable, right? I think that's important too. And really significantly from a mission perspective, we did not want Black and brown audiences to be only charitable endeavors. We actually see our people as a very important, vital, necessary market. Yeah. And so when we launched URL, we were 100% aligned. We didn't even have the nonprofit conversation because we said, this is a market. We believe in wealth creation for our communities. And guess what the best way to upset the power dynamic is? It's money, right? Yeah, and
absolutely.
So we did not want to kind of hide behind that. Now, for two women of color to come out with that ambition, someone yesterday from a large financial company that's a household name was like, that's really ballsy. And we were like, I mean, it's not if you're two white men launching a company, right? Like it's So we were upfront about that. And the other thing I'd say is that we also, similar to what you just said, we have room for all different types. So we have a mix of nonprofits and for-profits as our members. The for-profit model has also allowed us to launch an arm that's been really successful of a B2B recruitment, coaching, and executive placement arm. So we are doing business with fellow media outlets. And that, I think, I'll be honest, in the diversified revenue model, we often talk about, like print, digital,
Right.
television, broadcast, the B2B arm, I think is another. I know a lot of media companies are thinking about that in terms of research insights or consulting or so forth, but that's something we kind of fell into, but we really embraced. And I would say that this model also has allowed us to pivot towards opportunity pretty quickly.
That's so interesting. We're going to dive next into that, but first of all, there are a lot of publishers thinking about the B2B opportunities now because, by the way, we're information organizations. It's just, we forget about the information we had yesterday, except it's still there and it's valuable to somebody. But something you said was super powerful that I think is underappreciated, which is there is very much a tech Silicon Valley kind of idea of go narrow, do your one singular thing and do it well. And it pushed, I think, some number of publishers to thinking like super narrow. It actually turns out that a lot of media consumers, particularly in the news space, still like the buffet. I mean, by the way, look at what the New York Times is doing. They're trying to get the biggest buffet they can possibly get. You want games? We got that. You want sport? Because they are responding to people who, people don't go on Netflix just to watch documentaries, right? They want a buffet of options, and to some degree, news consumers are like that, and that is a kind of its own way newly revolutionary idea in this space, in the digital media space. But that's super powerful. But let's talk let's start high level, and then we're going to talk about sort of the what URL is doing to help in this space. So diversity in the news industry, or most profoundly lack thereof, for a really long time. There's just been very little progress for a very long time. Despite all of the announced intentions otherwise, right? Many news organizations have made it a priority. They talk about it. They're actually leaning it, trying to work internally. Some are obviously more focused than others. You hear about media organizations that are doing different things to show how they're increasing diversity and inclusion. But again, sometimes it seems like the needle's barely moved. What's your take on how much progress the industry has really made, and then what are the key elements before we have to start seeing sort of profound change in the industry and the diversity inclusion side?
So I'll give you the kind of half glass full answer first, which is as somebody who's devoted her entire career to diversity and hiring and content and coverage, and never had diversity in my title. For what it's worth, and this is my immigrant parents, like every job that you aspire to in the newsroom should be the biggest job you could get, right? Not the, and so they're big jobs in the center of the action, but really the through line of my 20 plus years in journalism has been trying to get the biggest job I can get in a newsroom and making sure that diversity is absolutely the way we're going to do business, right? So from a half full perspective, I have never in those decades seen as much attention to the subject as I have over the last 2 years. And that is heartening in some respects because we're playing catch up to decades, even centuries of neglect. So there's an urgency to, I must find X type of person. And the other conversation I would say that I never saw us having publicly is the need to be Black centered, as opposed to using terms like people of color or diversity or kind of more catch-all phrases the idea of centering Blackness, which I think people have talked about within movements, within even newsrooms and coverage for a while, was kind of a quieter conversation. And now I feel like we can talk about what that looks like. And for someone like me who's not Black, it really becomes even more incumbent upon us to show the way, to learn the way, to sort of stand up. But my co-founder is Black, but we talk all the time about like not having her be the only voice saying, here's a list of, I'm making this up, but freelance web designers. Is there a Black vendor among them? That's not only on her, that's on me too. And guess what?
Yeah.
We're a business that's centering diversity. Like, we're going through this, right? So I think that for me is incredibly invigorating, and that I made the pivot when I did gives me a level of power that I quite frankly don't think I would have had 5 years ago, right? And just having that conversation. The harder part is examining the power dynamics that we want diversity to exist within. And that's really hard. It's really uncomfortable. And you and I have talked about this before, because sometimes it feels like, of course, we're committed to diversity, but we just have to do this thing. We just have to move forward, And so that sort of leads to business as usual, when actually what the last few years have shown us, or hopefully led us to, is a need to press reset on the whole thing, right? I think that is a really hard exercise, and it's not fast. It's not, it's uncomfortable. And I don't know that everybody's ready for that. So now we're in this interesting time where there's still a lot of attention and lip service and, quite frankly, dollars towards diversity. But we've also, and I would argue the election of 2021 showed us this, the backlash to diversity initiatives is very palpable, right? Critical race theory was framed as an issue that's voting against what's happening in your kid's school. But I think it was really fueled by the guy who was just told by his chief diversity officer at work, which is a new hire, that he needs to be doing things differently now, right? And so there is this backlash that I think many of us fear, because we're like, no, we just got you to the place that a lot of us have been talking about for decades. Don't slide backward. Right?
Keep going.
Don't be afraid of what's, because this is going to be uncomfortable. This is just the beginning, right? This is just the beginning. So that's my honest assessment. On the other hand, like, we just, our 10th member of the URL Media Network is Native News, right? I'm elated that we have a Native News partner, but also I can't, and I am guilty of this. In my whole career, I can't think of a moment beyond the last year that I've seen Native issues in the same breath with Black and Latino and Asian issues. Like, it was so, and again, I am guilty of this. So I also think that there's a change in how we're talking about things, who we're talking about, who we're including, that's going to be new to all of us. And, I guess my message there would just be to be ready for that conversation, because I really do feel like we haven't seen much, it's still to come.
Just keep, we're all learning, but also I think most profoundly have to get, I don't know how you get more comfortable with the uncomfortable, if that's a phrase, but you have to get more okay with dealing with, hard subjects, hard perspectives, things that aren't always, self-reflection that's not always fun, but is important nonetheless.
And it changes you and I, I'm not saying this just to say this, but I think you model this in many ways, because it changes the culture of the organization when the leader is willing to be publicly discomforted and to say, we're still learning, and we're just that admission and vulnerability. It's not just you who's gone through that, it's the entire organization that then kind of shows a path for how we got to do this thing. And that's the part that I've seen really mixed results, because we're also, by the way, in a pandemic, and communication is really complicated right now, and people want to be as crystal clear as they can be. So the murkiness is not necessarily welcome. And yet, I mean, what are these conversations if not really complicated and necessary?
Yeah, I wrote an article a number of years ago. That particular article was about, it was in San Jose Mercury News, about tech, and particularly women in tech at the time. But we had done, in my old employer, we had actually done some studies about who did better, like why did some companies perform better. And it almost always just came back to, there was a leader, the CEO, who just demanded better,
Mm,
and it just talked about it all the time, enforced standards, just made it a complete focus. Because you'd like to think, particularly larger organizations like to think there's just some procedure we can put in place.
yeah,
There's
that's
some,
right. That's exactly right.
we can have some plug-in that all of a sudden, bing, we get this good result. And really, what a core that really moved the mass of the jello of the organization was just somebody who was willing to do hard things and be sort of obsessively focused on a difficult topic. Right now, we're going to do this. And by the way, if you work for me and you don't do it, you're not going to work for me anymore. I mean, that kind of level of obsession. But the truth is, if you do that, you can make a big difference, right? The jello can be moved, but it really takes true leadership. So in that, let's circle back to URL, and in particular, which I think is super innovative, the sort of B2B business you're building around helping companies, notably people in the media, about hiring, retention, the whole range of issues related to DEI.
So this happened pretty organically. We were meeting with mainstream newsrooms to pitch our syndication services. Meaning we have, at the time we had 8 partners, we can give you a daily report. And the newsrooms we were meeting with were like, well, we really would love to diversify our content. We're on board, but we don't have any diversity in our newsroom, right? Or maybe we don't have any diversity in our leadership ranks is another thing you would hear. And so it's very difficult for newsrooms to do the diversification of their content without having the leaders. And I said, well, I need to put leaders in place in your newsroom so that they understand the value of our content. Like I was pretty upfront about it,
We're starting at 0, so we have to get better than 0.
So I said, well, I've been hiring for 20 plus years. I could help you with that. And it started out, I promise you, David, started organically. And at one point, somebody said, we have an editor-in-chief search. Could we hire you to do that? And I had just left CNN, right? I had just left CNN at the end of 2020. And I have Epicenter, and Epicenter's okay, but I'm reading the same articles as you on no local news is sustainable. You must do it this way, right? I'm reading all the same articles, and URL is just a glimmer at that point. We're going to launch it in January. And so somebody had asked for help with their editor-in-chief search. And I said, okay, sure. And I just took it as a consulting contract. And in the course of the search, when the word was out that we were looking for diverse candidates, a really interesting thing happened. And some of this is just because I have been hiring for so long. People started contacting me and saying, and these are diverse candidates, the talent pool, saying, what's the secret to getting a top job? What should my memo look like? And I have been advising, I always joke, like people of color, women, and even white men ask me for help, right? Like it's all of them. And so I've been doing this for a long time. And so we started two tracks were developing at the same time, right? And they both needed each other. And you remember, 2021, the story of 2021 was really the labor force. It was a tight market. So newsrooms started to approach us, and initially it was just my Rolodex. And I said, I have a certain, I'm a certain age, I'm in a certain industry. I'm also in New York City. Why don't we cast about and get some more recruiters? And so today we have 4 recruiters from literally every pocket of the country and the Midwest at different age levels, different industries within media. And it's just diversified our own searches and what we offer, because in the beginning, it was a lot of executive placement, editors in chief, the C-level. What we're seeing now is mid-level, some entry level. So there's also so many startups, as you alluded, where they need to make like 40 hires in the next few months. So we've been
Yeah.
contacted by a number of those types of outlets. Now, we're not a traditional recruitment firm for a few reasons. A lot of executive search is like, unless we're going to get 6 figures out of this, it's not worth our while, right? So there's some of that.
Yeah.
They just shut the door. And I think a lot of newsrooms have not gone the route of traditional search because of that kind of blanket, like, we entertain your business, right? On the other hand, you had a plethora of staffing agencies, right? Newsrooms really never did that because if you need a freelancer, it's kind of short term. We don't hire in that way. So I would see us as a marriage of a few different models that are uniquely of this time. And again, we happen to launch in a year where if you were going to try anything, everything was being reinvented. So it was a good year to try different playbooks.
Yeah.
Mid-level managers are a really important area for us for 2 reasons. One, the candidate pool is often asking, how do we break in? And they'll tell us that before they're telling their own managers.
Yeah.
So in the marketplace, I think among diverse talent, there's a role that we're serving. Obviously, we don't charge them for that. We make our money from the B side of it, from the business, from the media, from the newsrooms themselves. But that candidate pool, by seeking us out, there's a lot of faith where we're treated kind of as their own people, like, help me get my career to this level. And what I love about that is that it's showing an assertion of what you want. As a manager, one of my greatest frustrations is when I would meet with someone, let's say for their annual review, and I would say, well, what do you want? And they would say, but nobody's ever asked me that before.
Yeah.
I'd say, well, have you asked yourself that before? Right? Like, I mean, there's just a lot of it that's just good management that I feel like we're able to still impart in the industry. And URL is small, Epicenter is small, but my background is in running teams that are large teams. And so I do feel like I get to flex a lot of that coaching and guidance of people's careers at a pretty large scale now with a lot of the most important newsrooms in the country, which for me feels like another gift that I've been given. The second piece, which might come off as negative, but I hope you see how this can be spun positively. Many newsrooms, when they take diverse talent through their interview processes, there's not a single interview with an editor of color, right? It's all white, either all white men, maybe there's a woman mixed in there. I mean, it's a real challenge to say our newsroom wants to do better when these are the faces you're putting forward of your newsroom, right? So that's just a reality that we have been able to call newsrooms out on it, and they're very upfront about why they're turning to us. So admitting that that's not the way they want business to go actually sends a signal to the marketplace. That's one thought. The other is on the mid-level manager. There's a number of managers that we coach through the process of how do you hire diverse talent is actually pretty intense. So one example I'll use is, if you have a manager who's so overloaded, and what newsroom manager is not, and they're not responding to the emails of a candidate, it's not just that you're ghosting someone in the course of an interview. To the candidate, you've suddenly shown them what it's like to work for you. Right?
Yeah. You're auditioning for them too.
Right. So there's a lot of that coaching that, because we come from the industry, I think it hopefully lands a little different than if it's an HR or staffing or recruitment agency. That I hope, my hope is people work with us and never do business the same again. That's really my hope.
The coaching part too is really interesting. This gets into, the retention issue, which is, again, like search, by the way. If you want to get high level, intense coaching, a lot of that's is focused on CEOs. I think a lot of people don't know that, like, most CEOs have these intense executive coaching relationships with folks. And, figuring out then how do you, first of all, anybody new to like a middle management position could use somebody to bounce ideas off of. And sometimes that can be their boss, but it often isn't. But in particular, if you feel like you are the only one for any variety of different dimensions, but particularly if you're a minority and you feel like you're the only one, where are you gonna get really straight up help and advice, honest kind of help and advice, and sort of the idea of having some level of coaching, executive coaching available to people there at that level, I think is a really rich area, but also must be critical to retention, right? Because you must deal
Right.
with a lot of retention issues.
So we have a lot of people who are, the only in their newsroom, and what we have started offering, there's 3 contracts we have right now that are people we've placed, and they'll have a few months to get acclimated, but in some cases they or their newsrooms have come forward and said, do you offer coaching services? And we do. So we're actually this year piloting a few different models. One is the cohort model, where you have a group of managers together, which I think has worked well. But I think the one-on-one attention that you're describing, that allows you to get 360 feedback, that allows people to be upfront about scenarios they're contending with and talking them through, that's really important. Just one aspect is, and I gloss over this, but it's really key to our model. We approach talent of color from a perspective of affirmation versus fixing you. And I think that's something else that's a little bit different from the
Oh,
marketplace,
interesting.
because so many, not just newsrooms, but so many companies, have like a playbook of, um, sit up straight, or
Yeah, yeah,
put your feet
correction.
on the
It's a
floor.
lot of rules.
There's like the introvert and this test you take, and I'm I have done all that. I have had an executive coach, and I'm a believer in it. And yet so much of coaching is trying to get you to be like everybody else. And if the last 2 years have taught us anything, it's that organizations need to be meeting leaders and infusing more of that diversity magic
God, that's so powerful,
in
right?
their
It's
organization.
such a powerful insight, right? You shouldn't be wanting to drive everybody to be like, here's our formula for success and jam you into that formula, right? That's misguided for a whole bunch of different reasons. But that's really powerful, Mitra.
Yeah. And also it just changes the posture of, not the literal posture in the way that a coach might talk to you about, but like it changes how somebody sees themselves, because I even said this at CNN, it's not like a new thing. I really do believe that a manager believing in his or her people or their people is fundamental to the success of those people. And the belief part, I mean, you've worked with managers where it's disingenuous. They just don't, it's just not
Yeah.
going to work. And so that belief for me is pretty fundamental. Now, there are people I've had rocky relationships with at work, but if I could find the one thing where, oh my gosh, you do this better than anyone else, and I just kind of focus on that, my entire demeanor towards you changes in a way that is affirming. And so your insecurities, hopefully, kind of start to melt. And how many candidates also have I talked to where with me, they wow me, and then they go to the organization and they kind of shrink, right? Something
Right.
happens in that. And so much of it is the energy that they're feeding off of. So there's definitely two-sided coaching that occurs.
That's fantastic. God, I could talk to you for like hours and hours and hours, and we'll have to do another one of these. Mitra, we're probably coming up to the end of the time here, but again, so many rich and powerful insights. Let's just on ending, just listen. There are a lot of folks who want to do startups in the media space, right?
Yeah.
In every kind of dimension. And you're kind of doing a couple at once, right? There's a content business, there's the
Really.
coaching business, there's the network businesses, which I think that is a powerful insight and model in and of itself. But so when somebody comes up to you and says, Mitra, I'm super excited about what you're doing. I really want to do my own startup in the media business. You know, leaning in on the optimism, I guess there's a lot of
Yeah.
cautionary tales, but what kind of one piece of advice would you think about giving somebody as at least a good start in terms of thinking about how you would do that?
I'll give you two, only because the first one is super fast, but I think what we don't talk about with startup life enough is, can you pay your mortgage? Can you put food on the table? Have you gotten the basics worked out? Because once that happens, you're still hungry, but things definitely become easier. And
Yeah.
people just don't talk about that. And I always
Yeah.
wonder magically, like, where are they getting this money? And in some cases, people will say to me, you're everywhere. You're launching 3 businesses. You write a column for Time. You're on these boards. And I'm like, I'm everywhere because that's my survival game though, guys. Like, I have to do this in order
Yeah.
to pay my mortgage, put food. So
Yeah.
I think one is just, it's okay. That is okay. And in some cases, our business was able to pivot because we were hungry for the opportunity. And I think a lot of that is in the roots, that Sarah and I share as a family. She's Black. My family, as I mentioned, were immigrants from India, raised in Puerto Rico. But we always had like extra people living in our basement, and, not like a whole lot, but enough food at the table for extra
Yeah.
people to join. So really operating from this place of abundance, but
Yeah.
seeking opportunity, I think, is just a good framework. The second piece is really pretty audience focused. So if you heard me talking about people are searching for this, people need this, we were trying to solve for organizations that were struggling with being discoverable on the internet, right? What is the need? Again, this is like probably Captain Obvious, but what is the need for your business? Feels like a good question to answer at the outset. And then the audience piece, I think for so long, audience, and this is a shift that I'm delighted by, but if there's a part 2 of this, I'd love to get other people's input too, or maybe yours. We really shorthanded audience for the last few years is social media, right? It was your audience on Facebook, your audience on Twitter, your audience on Instagram, and you could grow businesses that way. What we're building with both URL and Epicenter is harder, but it's, my goodness, so much more rewarding, because people come up to me and say, you helped me get a vaccine, and then you helped my mother get a vaccine, and then you did this. And so that relationship with audience is being, I think, redefined. Some of it, you might say, well, that sounds like newspapers 30 years ago, and so be it, right? Maybe it's just kind of a cycle and we're coming back to that. But I think any product you launch and the ability to get that affection from your user is a product worth launching. And I really lean into that relationship in a way that is surprising to me, because CNN is so built on the number of people who come to you. I might have interactions like the one I just described through Epicenter or URL, maybe once or twice a week, but really, when we talk about the sustainability of businesses for an entrepreneur, that's really all sustaining.
Oh yeah, depth of relationship, right? That'll carry you through all sorts of times. Anyway, Mitra, thank you so much. Thank you for being so generous with your time. Super great and important conversation, in which we kind of only scratch the surface, so we have to do it again. But listen, from News Media Lines, I just want to really thank you very much. This was great. Really, very much enjoyed it, and I think it's important for our audience.
Oh, thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Take care.